So we're just discussing it, money creation, because a lot of people, the average person doesn't understand how these corporations work, how they make their money, what are ways they can do it, and what are they being taxed anyways, right? Because they're just being, as my understanding is, they're just being taxed a very small percentage.
And even then, there's so many loopholes. I remember one time we had a guest speaker come to Mount Allison who understood the tax laws in great detail, and he said, if we could just erase one line out of the tax code that would basically pay for almost everything else we have in the society, it's the ability for the corporations to kind of wine and dine and buy box seats and things like that and write it off as a business expense. If they couldn't write that off, just that savings alone would provide so many of the areas, the literacy programs, the healthcare, the homelessness issues. So there's so many opportunities for them to, even when they are required to pay, to not to have to come through. In fact, there's quite a clever Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that was going around. I don't know if you had seen this one. So he's got his little lemonade stand, $15 for the lemonade. So his little skeptical friends kind of coming over and sort of saying, really, $15? He's like, well, I have to pay myself, a really good salary, and I have to have profits, for my shareholders, and I have to make sure that I have this great sort of lifestyle and return on my investment that's very healthy. And then they're like, but that's just like sludge water. Well, I have to cut costs somewhere. And so they're like, well, I'm not buying that. And so then it's sitting around, nobody's buying it. And so then he goes back into the mom, and the mom's like, I need a subsidy, because basically I need a bailout because I've completely mismanaged this entire lemonade stand. And I think the reason that that's circulating around on the internet and people find that humorous is because it just kind of conceptualizes at a very small level exactly what they're seeing happening at this, sort of international level of banking and finance.
That's a great segue, actually, because I wanted to bring up the issue of the bank bailouts in the States. That's, of course, probably the number one issue with Occupy Wall Street is the fact that, Wall Street caused the problem in 2008. Nobody went to jail for it. They got trillions of dollars in TARP stimulus package to bail them out. And, here we are losing our houses, and we as citizens losing our houses. What was the alternatives? Well, if you want to follow their economic model, if you actually went with what they were following, you would have let them fail. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's the way to go. But if you use the Milton Friedman Chicago school,
let's say we let a majority of those big banks fail, where would we be? The reality is,
we would have to find another way, wouldn't we?
Well,
sometimes that happens though. There's a lot of new entrepreneurs, there's a lot of alternatives, and they can't come through when there's already the biggest player in the room. The same thing happens in terms of energy. If we finally decided that we weren't going to go with the sort of fossil fuel-based energy, we would find out how fast those wind farms, would be able to come out, and that solar, because there are people just waiting to come in with the alternatives, and they're being shut out. So we might have seen that. But we could also have had the bailouts hand in hand with regulation. You don't just give the money and say, well, hopefully you don't do that again. Gotcha. You could say, you get this money and there's going to be a whole new game in town.
That's right. The Air Canada situation with the government threatening back-to-work lection for airline attendants, or for flight attendants, again, that's government and big business tied together and scratching each other's back. They know where the politicians know where their funding comes from. It's not you or I giving your $25 or $100 a year to your political party of choice where they make their money and where they really get that war chest. It's corporations. It's industry that's in there. And what we're saying is, they can have a seat at the table, but we need a seat there too, and we're just as important as they are. Again, this bank bailout, again, I want to go back to that because Occupy Wall Street was sort of centered around that. And another big reaction I hear here is amongst, get a job or you dirty hippie, is Canada didn't bail out our banks. Why are we complaining about this in Canada? We have a great financial services sector, very stable. That's not true. That is a complete myth. It's spin and propaganda that the government feeds you. 4 days before the last federal election, our government bailed out our big 5 banks to the tune of $75 billion to the CMHC 4 days before the election. So it just got lost in the news cycle because there's an election going on. It was barely reported in the media, but it happened. It's fact. The government, through the CMHC, bought up $75 billion worth of risky mortgages from the big 5 banks. So what that did is freed up those banks to then lend out more money. They weren't going to hold the credit back as much as they did in the States when the economy went down. And we did this in Canada. We bailed out our banks to $75 billion. We as Canadian taxpayers now own $75 billion worth of at-risk mortgages. That's no different than what happened in the States. $75 billion in Canada is equivalent to $750 billion in the US because the population and the economies are different, 10 times bigger in the States. That's exactly what the US, how much they bailed out their banks, their Wall Street with, $75 billion, sorry, $750 billion. It's equivalent. We did that. Do you know where the government got the $75 billion to bail out the banks?
The banks.
They borrowed it from the banks.
This doesn't make any sense.
Thank you.
So it's like a cycle that just keeps going around and around.
It is a snake that eats its tail.
And
that is what our economy is.
It kind of sounds like we're living on money that we don't even actually have.
You are, thank you. You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
That is
Very
exactly.
good point, Tara. I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, well, you know, it's kind of like when we take the MasterCard to pay the Visa, and then we take the Visa to pay the MasterCard.
That is what our economy is.
That's how the economy works.
That is
And this
how
probably
it works.
hits close to home because people who can't make it from month to month and they have to rely on their credit cards, and then the next month they say, okay, hopefully I can pay this off, or I have to pay this off, but then that gets pushed behind because something else is coming, and you're going from credit card to loan, realizing then you get yourself in a situation where you can't pay it back, and then what do you do?
I am the 99%, okay? I'm 43 years old. I've paid my taxes. I've worked hard. I've had good jobs. I've been able to make a little bit more, I think, than the average Canadian has in the past. I worked for corporations. I had good peer reviews and good HR reviews. I did a good job. I was promoted in different places. And because a corporation figured they could find someone who could do my job for less than me, I and a number of other people lost their jobs last spring. So I was unemployed for 6 months. And it's pushed me to the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say it.
When you say that, is that because they've outsourced outside of the country?
No, they found someone who might have just graduated from university or something like that, who would be willing to take the job at $30,000 a year instead of a higher salary.
Live in their parents' basement.
Living in their parents' basement, right? Just starting out, don't have a family to support.
And again, it boils
And they're
down
not
to
understanding
It boils down to they're able to then take that difference between my salary and their salary and pocket it. That's exactly it. It now becomes profit instead of an expense.
And then if they get frustrated and they say, look, I need more money, I want to unionize, I want to go on strike, I can't live on minimum wage, and then all of a sudden they're like, we'll legislate you and tell you what your wages are going to be, and there's only so long you can do that. At some point the Conservatives are going to realize that a lot of who they consider to be their base are people who expect to earn more than $8 an hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, when they get in trouble, the banks are getting leveraged a little bit too much, and then again with those mortgages and stuff, they go to the government for a bailout. If I get in trouble financially as an individual and I can't pay my credit card this month, if I call up my credit card company and say, look, can you give me a break?
Call your MP.
What do you think the answer's going to be?
Let's call our MP and say, hey, I need a bailout. I spent a little too much. I can't quite, I mismanaged my finances. I'm wondering, you think maybe?
No.
No.
I would say no. If you make the call, I would say absolutely not.
And let's be clear too, another thing we hear a lot, again, the attacks that are coming at Occupy Wall Street movement is, you got yourself into trouble. If you don't have a job, it's your own fault. Or if you're in debt, it's your own fault. Yeah, it is our own fault. Yes, absolutely. We take responsibility as citizens for probably taking too much debt or buying a house that might be a little bit more expensive than we probably should have. But the banks, it's like crack. The banks offer you those super low rates and they try to get you as much money out of you as possible. I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who have maxed out their credit cards, and as soon as they get to the max, the bank ups their maximum. That's a crap dealer.
It's the credit system that's actually let the system go on for as long as it has, so that people, if they had to face the inequity at the time, they would have said, this is a crisis, we have to do something about it. But they just kept saying, well, you can keep having your lifestyle on a bit more credit, and so the system was allowed to go and get so much worse before people really now are coming to the streets and say, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, because now people are maxed out. There isn't any more credit. Even the Americans all owe the Chinese for the credit, and so they're like, okay, now there is no little thing that we can do to kind of take the winds out of the sails of your revolution and just say, oh, here, go on a vacation and forget all about this, because we've now hit the wall and now something has to be done, which is why people are, occupying Moncton.